When I first learned about my inner critic, I was determined to get rid of it. I was going to do anything and everything possible so that I never had to hear its mean words again. But I failed miserably, and there's a good reason why. I'm Nicola, and I bet you've gone to battle with your inner critic just like I did, trying to silence it in any way possible, because let's face it, it never really says anything we want to hear, right? It can be frustrating and often downright brutal. So let's talk about why it is that you'll never actually be able to kill off your inner critic. But first, we need to talk about why it's there in the first place. That vicious inner voice, the one that tells you everything that's wrong with you and your life and everyone around you, it's a defense mechanism, and it comes from childhood, and it's an attempt to protect ourselves from further emotional pain. It often happens in situations where there is neglect or abuse or abandonment, or just some situation where we don't bond effectively with our primary caregivers. And when we don't have that strong connection with our parents, we feel unsafe, and it creates a lot of anxiety and fear. And so the inner critic steps in to try and protect us in that situation. It preempts the criticisms, the mistakes, the failings, the things we're going to get wrong. It tries to tell us all the things that we're doing wrong to prevent a situation where we have that emotional pain from our primary caregivers. And it's a kind of negative noticing, where we're constantly noticing the negative things about us to try and avoid having those situations with our caregivers where things go really badly. And I know in my situation, I still, as an adult, struggle to break the rules. If someone says you're not allowed to do that, I really struggle to go against that, even though some of these rules are silly or frivolous or completely arbitrary. And to be honest, there's a lot of that going around these days. There's a part of me that says, no, it's not safe. If you break the rules, something bad will happen. And so that negative noticing is me trying to make sure I don't get in trouble for whatever rule it is that I'm about to break. The inner critic also tries to catch dangers early. So it is trying to notice risks and threats to us before something bad happens. And this leads to hypervigilance, where we are in a constant state of high alert, trying to notice all the things around us that might be a threat to us. I know as a child, I learned to really notice my mum's moods, because I never knew when she was going to have a bad day, and either I was going to have to try and stay out of her way or appease her in any way possible. And so that is that hypervigilance of watching out for the signs and cues from the environment around you that something is off track and something's about to go wrong. And this mechanism has its foundations in biology. It's actually built into our makeup, because back when we lived in tribal societies, in small groups, in less fancy civilization, we depended very heavily on each other to survive. And so this mechanism was a way to keep us in check, because if we were living in one of these societies and we broke the rules that allowed us to survive as a tribe, often it would mean we would get thrown out of the tribe, we would get excommunicated from that tribe because we were a threat to the survival of the tribe. But we just simply can't survive in those situations without the tribe, and so being thrown out was basically certain death. And so this mechanism is trying to prevent us from breaking those rules so that we don't die. It's a primitive survival mechanism that's trying to keep us alive by protecting us from all these mistakes we might make, all these threats that might happen to us. So it actually serves a purpose. It's trying to protect us. The problem comes when it gets corrupted by childhood experiences, when this mechanism, instead of just helping us in this tribal society, actually gets corrupted by this abuse or this neglect in childhood. It gets distorted, it gets very overactive, almost like a muscle that we use too much, a muscle that gets overdeveloped. I remember when my first child was a baby, he had a lot of trouble getting to sleep, and so my husband spent many hours pacing the halls, rocking him on his left arm, trying to help him settle and get calm enough that he could sleep. And because he used his left arm for this, it became significantly stronger than his right arm. And he is right-handed, but his left arm was actually stronger. And this is what happens with the inner critic. It is a mechanism that gets so overused in response to these experiences that it becomes overdeveloped. It is out of proportion. And it gets very loud and very vicious because it's had so much practice talking us down, trying to keep us safe, but giving us all this negative feedback about us. We get into a negative feedback loop. And what I mean by that is we have an experience as a child and we say, okay, I need to prepare for this and to make sure I don't make that mistake again. So we catch ourselves and we say, don't do that. But then the experience happens again. It doesn't work for some reason. And so we end up going, okay, well, obviously I need to tell myself even harder not to do that. I need to talk myself down even more. And then we do that. But then the experience still happens and we think, okay, I've got to try harder. I've got to criticize myself more. And we get to a point where we feel like the only way to survive this is to criticize ourselves as hard as possible. And we spiral in this negative feedback loop of being harsher and harsher to ourselves. And that's how that vicious inner critic emerges. And as adults, we carry this with us, but often we're not even aware of it. We can find ourselves in full swing, tearing ourselves to pieces without even realizing how we got there or what just happened. It's very much an emotional flashback when that happens. And I've got a whole video about that you might want to watch next. But this is, inner critic is just tearing us apart. And we're in the middle of this and we don't even realize what's happening sometimes. And also this very loud inner critic feels like a friend, a familiar friend. It's not a good friend by any measure, but it is something that is familiar and comfortable. And so it kind of feels safe because as kids, we learned that doing this increased our chances of safety. Now, maybe it didn't work, but we were doing it to achieve safety. So we have this sense that if we allow the inner critic to run rampant, it actually makes us safer, which means that we allow it to keep happening because for some bizarre, twisted reason, it actually feels safe to do so. But unfortunately, that inner critic is something that we can never kill off. I have tried everything. I have tried ignoring it, interrupting it, correcting it, and my inner critic is still there. And unfortunately, we can't even silence it completely. So why is that? Well, because this inner critic is actually part of us. It is supposed to be there. It is effectively our superego gone bad. So the superego is a concept that came from Freud, and he had three parts of our consciousness or our mind. One was id, which is our subconscious. One is ego, which is our conscious self. And the other is superego, which is the over self, or the one that watches over us and makes sure we're doing the right thing so that we do survive. And so this became our moral compass. And it's just that this superego has become corrupted and it's not serving it the purpose it was supposed to serve. It just learned the wrong things. It just learned bad habits and it thinks it's in charge. It's trying to protect us and keep us safe from pain, from danger, whatever it is. And so in theory, we could be grateful for it. We could appreciate the fact that it's trying to protect us. But honestly, given how badly it behaves towards us, it's pretty hard to be grateful for something that is so mean and so critical and so unhelpful, honestly. Instead, what we need to do is shrink it back to its proper size. We need to find a way for it to go back to doing what it was supposed to do. We can get it to be quieter. For example, having done this practice of shrinking the inner critic for so many years, mine does not pipe up as often as it used to, and it's not as loud as it used to be. It still comes up in situations, but it's not nearly as noisy as it used to be. And I've noticed actually that it's less these days about criticizing me, although that still happens, and more about spotting danger. And I've noticed this, I've read this in a few other people's experience, that what seems to happen as we do this work to shrink down the inner critic is that the self-criticism is what goes first, but what remains often is the awareness of danger. And so what the inner critic seems to do is to use danger as a way back in. It's a bit of a sneaky fiend, and it will use the threat of danger as a way back in to try and take back that control. We can also get it to feel more comfortable. So if we feel safer, or if we feel like there's less need to protect ourselves from pain or threats, it can relax a little bit, and then it is less in control. But in my experience, it is incredibly stubborn. And when I started resisting my inner critic's voice, it fought back. It really amped up its efforts. So it got louder and more frequent before it became quieter, because I guess it sees that if I start to ignore it, then the danger has increased. The danger it's trying to protect me from is suddenly more of a threat because I'm no longer actually paying it the attention I used to. So be aware of the possibility that as you try and quieten down your inner critic, it will actually get louder for a period of time. And what we can do is interrupt it, so we can actually stop it in its tracks as it tries to tell us what's wrong or what's about to go wrong. We can say things in anger, because anger is a really great way for us to put boundaries in place. And if you still struggle with boundaries, I've got a step-by-step guide on boundaries that you might want to download. But using anger as a way to stop the inner critic in its tracks can be incredibly effective. We're giving ourselves that protection that we didn't have as kids. We're learning how to set boundaries in place and say, no, I'm not willing to accept that. And some of the great things you can say are things like no, or stop, or cancel, or go away, or shut up, or whatever it is that you want to say that interrupts that voice and stops it from continuing with its rant. Because if it gains momentum, if we don't stop it early on, it can gain momentum. And the more momentum it gains, the harder it is to stop. So stopping its tracks as early as possible can be really effective. The other thing we can do is actually correct it or counter it. So when it says something that's not actually correct, we can counter it and say, hey, that's not actually true. And I think one of the most effective ways to do this is to collect proof, so that you have that proof at the ready that you can use to counter that voice when it comes out with this idea that somehow you're flawed or you're broken or you've messed this up or whatever it is. And I've got a video that takes you through that practical process in more detail that you might want to watch after this one. But in my experience, what's worked really well for me is to create a brag book. And this is just a list of things that I've achieved that I forget in those moments, but I can go back when I am feeling like my inner critic is being especially loud, and remind myself that I have done great things over the years. And sometimes it's just a list. Sometimes I write them out in detail. The other thing we can do is use logic. If you have a strong mind like I do, it can actually be really powerful to use logic against the inner critic, because the inner critic is not rational. A lot of the things it says don't actually make sense. So if you can use logic and reason against its arguments, sometimes you can use its arguments against itself, and then you can end up tying the inner critic in knots, and that can really slow it down and take the power out of its statements. You can also replace some of the mean words of the inner critic with better versions. So if it says something like, you're stupid, you can water that down if you like. You can say, well, I might not be the smartest card in the deck, but, I'm able to keep pace with the average person. Or if it says, nobody likes you, you can say, well, I actually have some friends, so some people like me. Maybe not everyone likes me, but some people like me. And doing this takes some of the sting away, takes some of the power away out of those statements that inner voice, that inner critic is trying to throw you to tear you down. But essentially what we're doing here is we are constantly challenging its attempts to attack us and to alert us to danger. We are constantly challenging those voices in whatever way we can. But it's important that we have patience, because this is a mechanism that developed in response to relentless experiences as a child of not feeling safe, of not knowing what was going on, of not feeling connected. And so it's going to take relentless practice on our part to quieten it down. It is not a one and done thing. It is not something we can just do once and then it will magically disappear. It is a constant practice. The practice may change over time, but we need to have patience and allow it to take the time it needs to take. We also need to make sure that as we do this, that the inner critic doesn't flip into the outer critic. So the inner critic is attacking us. The outer critic attacks everyone else. It says everyone else is awful and dangerous, and we need to be really careful that we don't allow it to morph into a vicious outer critic, because what that will do, that will damage our relationships and it will alienate us from everyone around us. So when you follow this practice over time, you'll end up in a place where your inner critic pipes up now and then, but you're able to mostly ignore it or gently counter or redirect its energy towards something else more constructive. You may reach a point where you're able to embrace what it says and work with it, but this is something that takes a lot of time. I wouldn't try and rush to that place, because if you do that in the early days, it can be an opportunity and an opening for it to sneak back in and take back control. So that's not something you really want to do until you've really shrunk it back down to its proper size. And you reach a place where you hear it, but you don't believe it. You see what it's trying to do, but you don't take it too seriously. The other day I was editing a video and there was an issue with the sound in the video, just a minor issue. And I was trying to decide, do I record it? Can I make this work? I decided to use it as it was and make it work. And my very helpful inner critic piped up and said, yeah, no one's going to watch it anyway, so what does it matter? Which was very unkind and very unhelpful, But I recognized in the moment what it was trying to do, and I was able to just to laugh at it because I could see that it was trying to keep me safe in the most unhelpful way possible, and a not very nice way, but I could just laugh that off. So now you know why you'll never be able to kill off the inner critic. It's supposed to be there. It's just learned some really, really bad habits, and now you get to go through the process of breaking those habits so it can go back to playing the role it's supposed to play. And to understand what emotional flashbacks are, how the inner critic contributes to them, and how they might be controlling your life, watch this video next. Got questions? Comment below, and I'll see you in the next one.